Amen. If you have a Bible with you this morning, I want to invite you to join me in the book of Genesis chapter 28. If you didn't happen to bring a Bible with you, all of these references will be on the screen behind me as we get going today, but you're going to want to keep your Bibles open this morning because not only will we be in the 28th chapter, but I'll be sharing a lot of the context around the story that we'll be walking through together this morning. And as you're turning, I just want to say how proud I am of all of you that you braved this freezing weather to make it to church this morning. You went out, you hooked up the sled dogs, you bundled up, you put the chains on the tires. You fought so hard to make it. And for all of you who stayed home and are watching us online, you were so intelligent to stay there where it was warm. And by the way, this isn't called kissing up, this is called campaigning, and we should all be used to that by now, right? Next Sunday, oh, by the way, I hope out of all that Pastor Mike shared, especially marked down February the 14th, if you would like to be baptized, if you've accepted Christ and you've never yet followed him in baptism, or that's something you'd like to learn more about, then contact us. We have an orientation class. February the 14th, the next baptisms. Those are always wonderful times in the life of our church, and I'm sure it will be for you. So let us know if you want to be baptized. Bring some friends. It'll be a great celebration. And there's another thing I want to make you aware of. Next Sunday is Sanctity of Life Sunday. In our family at First Baptist Church is hosting a life training event at 5 o'clock in the evening at their church. If you would like to figure out or find out how you can get involved in working for protecting the life of the unborn, then I would encourage you to go be a part of that at First Baptist Church. I know that most of you have been watching the news this past week, and our country has taken a very dark shift, especially for life. A very dark shift has taken place in our nation. And I think that most of us in the church are finally beginning to learn that our Messiah is never going to come from Washington, D.C. So these coming years are going to present a new challenge for us in the church. We've taken a lot of things for granted in what we have thought for years was a Christian nation. And I think that we're going to have to decide that change, if it's going to happen, is going to happen when people on a local level decide what we're going to do. When it comes to educating our children, what will we do? How much longer are you folks going to keep handing this over to people who don't know your God and don't share your values? And we have to make up our minds that what our kids believe and what they value is more important than what university they get their degree from and whether they make six figures when they graduate. And so we're going to have to decide as a church how we're going to prepare our children. We're going to have to take responsibility for that. And High Point Church is going to be in the center of those decisions. So I want you to be praying about that. It doesn't end here, but it begins here. Every year, thousands and thousands of unborn children are murdered in our country. And we have to answer for that. And so if this is something that burdens you, then I would encourage you to pray about being a part of this Sanctity of Life Training Sunday at First Baptist Church next Sunday evening at 5. I think it would be a great place for you to begin. If you have your Bibles, I'm in Genesis chapter 28. I'm going to start reading this morning at verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and headed for Haran. And when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. And he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. I think I've told you all this, but my brother Jerry and I are twins, and in fact, if you've been here long enough, I've also shared this point of pride with you. My brother and I were the first set of twins who were ever born in Community Hospital in Anderson, Indiana. I haven't done anything noteworthy since then, so that's my claim to fame. And one of these days, I'm going to have a plaque put on my wall. First set of twins ever born at Community Hospital in Anderson. 2 weeks after I was born, my mother carried us into Jackson Park Church of God in Christmas stockings, and I was a church brat. And what I mean by that is we were there every time the doors were open. And folks, people took church seriously back then. You were in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, every vacation Bible school, every revival service, every potluck, every garage sale, every youth event. We were there. I spent more time in church than I did in my own house sometimes. And this is what prayer meeting was like at Jackson Park. Every Wednesday night, we had prayer meeting, and it would start with maybe a few songs and somebody sharing a testimony and a special number. And Pastor Skinner would share a quick devotion, and then prayer time came in. And now, Jackson Park, and some of you will recognize this when I describe it to you, but Jackson Park was a long cracker box kind of church building, and it had those pews that had the red material on them. Do y'all remember? And the long red carpeted aisleways. And does anybody go to a church like this? That was our church. And when prayer time came, you didn't bow your head and listen politely as somebody else prayed. No, everybody got on their knees to pray at the pew, and everybody prayed. 35 people would pray. And you start praying as a kid, dear God, please let this get over with. Do something miraculous to end this service. My mom would pack us along, and she would give us these big crayons, and I was laying underneath the pew coloring pictures of Captain America or whatever I was doing during prayer just to keep us quiet. And this one particular prayer meeting, Sister Skinner, who was related to Brother Skinner by marriage, she was his sister-in-law, she played the accordion. Now, if you're under the age of 30, you may not 50, you may not know what an accordion is, but just picture welding a set of bellows and a mini piano together and strapping it to your chest. And squeezing it. This is how it was called a squeeze box, by the way. Doesn't that sound like a wonderful instrument? And she played the special on the accordion. By the way, if you ever bump into somebody that can play an accordion really well, it sounds nice. She could not. It didn't sound nice. An accordion that's not played well sounds like a cat being beaten. That's what it sounds like. And so we had gone through that, and the time for prayer had come, and everybody had turned to kneel at their pew, and her husband had gone up to try and discreetly remove the accordion from the sanctuary. Now, to the left of our podium was a doorway that led to a stairwell that went down 4 steps, and then there was a landing, and then it made a turn and went down another 10 steps to the basement and a concrete floor. This is where all the Sunday school classrooms were. So her husband made his way towards this door, and when he got to the top of the stairs, he dropped the accordion. So it hit 4 stairs, carpet, down to the first landing, and everybody stopped. And we waited to see what the accordion would do next. Would it go to the parking lot or decide to go to Sunday school down in the basement? It went to Sunday school. Squonk, bonk, bang, bonk. That was the best prayer meeting I've ever been to in my whole life. And I looked over at my mother, who's one of the godliest women I ever knew, and she's at her pew trying not to laugh out loud while she's praying. And then over to my left, here goes Sister Hamill, again, one of the mothers of the church, just a godly woman. She used to walk the aisles waving her hanky and praising God. But this Wednesday night, she's crawling out of the sanctuary on her hands and knees as fast as she can so she won't bust out laughing at the accordion. Now, I tell you all of this just so that you will understand that I know Jacob. I have an awful lot in common with him. Jacob, who we're reading about today, was a twin. His brother's name was Esau, but they didn't get along. In fact, a big reason why we find Jacob in the desert is because of the struggles he had with his brother. They did not like one another. Also, Jacob was a church brat. Jacob had raised his whole life being taught about his daddy's God and about his granddaddy's God. And he'd heard all the stories about how God had promised to bless his father. And he'd heard how he was the promised child and how his daddy was the promised child. He knew all about this God they talked about, but he certainly didn't know God. He'd never met him, didn't have a relationship with him. And on this night that we read about together, God used a staircase to get Jacob's attention. We're coming back to this series we started last week called Bumping Into God, where we're learning that what we celebrated at Christmas, that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. That is a fact that persists to this day. It didn't end at Christmas. It didn't end at his ascension, but we serve a God who is always with us, always active, always moving in our lives. But the theme of our lives could be that the line that Jacob speaks in verse 16 of this 28th chapter, where he says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I wasn't aware of it. How many of us live our lives like that? God is active around us, and we're simply not aware of how he's working. So Jacob bumps into God after he leaves Beersheba, which is where his father's house was. And at the end of this story, in verse 21, he finally says, "Then the Lord will be my God." The Lord was his daddy's God. The Lord was his parents' God. He had heard the stories. He knew them, but he didn't know God. So he had to go off on his own journey, off to college, off to find a wife, off to try and make a career for himself, off to find his own life before he finally bumped into the living God. One man has written it this way: Christianity is more than just a theory about the universe or teachings written down on paper. It is a path along which we journey. It's a way of life. There's only one means of discovering it. You have to step out onto the path. You have to commit to this way of life. The creed does not belong to you until you live it. No one can be a Christian secondhand. God has all kinds of children. He doesn't have any grandchildren. God has all kinds of children. He doesn't have any grandchildren. This is a story for all of us church brats, all of us youth group kids who played at church on Sunday and partied with our friends in the groves the rest of the week. This is for all you Lake Wales Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Methodists and Baptists and Pentecostals. You kids that were dedicated and confirmed and baptized, but you were never saved. You went to church your whole life because your folks made you go. And that's how you make connections in a little town like Lake Wales. And if you want your business to prosper, where you go to church is important. But you went to church to make business contacts, not to meet the living God. That's who this story is for. For all of us provincial Polk County church people living on a secondhand faith, this story shows us how God works to wake us up and snap us out of our religious sleepwalking. So let's walk through this time together and learn how Jacob bumped into God. And the first thing that I think that we learn is, why do we struggle so much? Even when we're around it all of the time, why do we struggle so much to see God? The story starts: Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, and he lay down to sleep. Jacob left Beersheba. He left his daddy's house. Now, most scholars say that Jacob was 47 years old by the time he did this. 47 before he left the house. Talk about failure to launch, folks. 47 before he ever left the home. Never been away. And here's another bit of information that kind of helps you understand his story. Back in the 25th chapter, it talks about the day he was born. Verse 24, when the time came for her, Rebekah, to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. Could you imagine the scene? Honey, is it a welcome mat or a baby? I don't know. He's red all over. His body's like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau, which means red. They could have named him Harry. They went with red. After this, his brother came out. His hand was grasping Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob. Jacob means someone who trips somebody else up. He grabs by the heel to trip other people up, so they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man in the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So Jacob is really out of his element when we find him out in the desert. He knows he doesn't belong here. This is Esau's atmosphere. This is where Esau is at home. Esau was the kind of guy who got an adrenaline rush out of going to the Bass Pro Shop and the Rural King or Cabela's. Esau, a morning in a tree stand waiting for a deer was like paradise for Esau. He loved to hog hunt. He camped out. He cooked out. He collected guns. He hunted stuff. He killed stuff. He field dressed stuff. He smoked stuff. He ate stuff. He loved this stuff. That was Esau's life. But not Jacob. Jacob was a mama's boy. Jacob's idea of adventure was trying out a new HelloFresh recipe while him and Mom took in the latest episode of Downton Abbey together. I'm just telling you all the truth. And you can tell that Jacob has no clue what he's doing by the first thing that he does when he stops for the night. He takes a rock and uses it as a pillow. Come on now. Now, I know what y'all are thinking. We're just afraid to say this stuff out loud because you think it's disrespectful to the Bible, but you're all thinking it. Well, a rock for a pillow? That's kind of a weird thing to do. And you're sitting there because you're church brats. You're sitting there and you're thinking, well, there must be some spiritual reason for this. There must be some deep symbolism as to why Jacob chose a rock for a pillow. No, there isn't. Jacob used a rock for a pillow because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's completely out of his element. He can't even figure out how you're supposed to sleep outside. And if you can't even figure out how to make a pillow when you're out on your own, how are you going to build a fire? How are you going to cook anything? How are you going to defend yourself out here in the wild? He's alone for the first time in his life. He's in the middle of the desert in the dark. He's scared to death, and he doesn't have the first clue what he's doing. Have y'all ever been in situations like this? Ever been someplace where you know you don't belong, scared to death, and you're putting on a good show, but you know you're completely out of your element? We've all been in situations like this. First day on a job, first day at a new school, when you walk into that classroom and every head turns towards you, or the first day that you have to teach your first class of heathen kindergartners that have never heard anyone say no to them in their whole life. Your first day, when you're trying to make it happen in a new neighborhood with new challenges for which you just aren't prepared, and you're separated from everyone that you know and everything that you've ever counted on and everything that you were comfortable with, you're just trying to fake it till you make it. Those temporary situations are frightening and they're awful. But I'm going to tell you that I think a lot of people live their whole lives like this, completely out of their element, never quite feeling at home or feeling connected. Frightened and awful in these situations. It's a deep spiritual condition that the Bible calls alienation. Alienation, that deep disconnect that we have from our God and so from our true selves in real life. It all began with sin. You all know the story of the fall, but I want you to take the time with me to look at it one more time. All the way back in Genesis chapter 2, after God had brought Adam and Eve together and introduced them to one another, the last verse of the second chapter says this, "And Adam and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed." Now, the Bible doesn't throw that into some sort of gratuitous peep show line. It's communicating a deep truth to us about how God intended for us to live our lives. He wanted us to be people who didn't have anything to hide from one another or from Him. Completely without shame, completely at home in our world, completely at home with ourselves and with one another, not hiding, not covering up, not ashamed of ourselves, complete open intimacy and comfort with who we are and who we were created to be. But you know the story, and you remember the fall. We believed that lie. We believed that lie that somehow we could do it better, that somehow we could learn how to do it better and figure it out better than God did. What tree did we go for? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, we won't accept what God says is good. We won't accept what God says is good or what God says is evil. We want to make those decisions for ourselves. So we'll do the research, we'll run the focus groups, we'll start the universities, we'll do all of the studies, and we'll come up with our own conclusions about good and evil. So we took a bite from that tree. And what were the results of all of that knowledge? The man and woman realize that they're naked and they run from one another and they sew fig leaves together to cover themselves up. So now we're hiding from one another. And then they hear the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day and they hide from Him. They say we were ashamed because we were naked. And God says, who told you that you were naked? So now this knowledge has brought you separation from one another and separation from God. And then when God asked the question, Adam does the noble thing, like every husband, throws his wife under the bus. It was that woman you gave me, God. By the way, it was that woman you gave me. So it's not just her fault, God. It's your fault that I'm in this situation. This woman that you gave me. So now all of this dysfunction. And then look what God says to the woman. Because you've done this, your desire is going to be for your husband, and he will rule over you. In other words, folks, I want you to understand all this hierarchical garbage that we have, all of this confusion, all this worked up we get about women's rights. Listen, none of that was in God's original plan. God never intended for us to relate to one another as men and women this way. It happened because we screwed it up. Your desire will be for your husband. You're going to spend your whole life wanting him to love you, and he will dominate you. And then in verse 19, he looks at the man and he says, "For the rest of your life, you're going to eat bread by the sweat of your brow. The ground's cursed by you. Because of you, we sinned and we were disconnected from our God. We were disconnected from one another. We were disconnected from our purpose. We're living in fear. We're ashamed of who we are. We're afraid that nobody would love us if they know us as well as we know ourselves. We are willing to put up with someone abusing us because we're so desperate for somebody to love us, killing ourselves to make a living and build careers because we've alienated ourselves from our God." Here's how the Bible sums it up. You were alienated from God and you became enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. This isn't an obscure theological truth that we kick around in seminary classes. This is the reality that we live every day of our lives. Jacob did. Jacob's family was a catastrophe. It was an absolute disaster. His parents, Isaac and Rebekah, were never going to be asked to lead a parenting class at church because they were lousy parents. They played favorites. They created a rivalry between their sons. The boys watched their father, Isaac, lie and put their mother's life at risk to spare his own life. When Rebekah was in the kitchen cooking with Jacob, she taught him how to lie to and manipulate his daddy and cheat his brother, and Jacob got good at it. And he did it, lied and cheated. Lied to his dad, cheated his brother out of the family blessing. And what's the result? In the 27th chapter, in the 41st verse, his brother says, "The time for my father's mourning is near, and then I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill my brother." What he's saying is, once my dad dies, I'm off in Jacob. And by the way, Esau was always packing so he could do it quick. I'm going to kill that guy. And in the meantime, Esau went out and married some local ladies. And I want you all to see this. He got married to some Hittite women, and here's what Rebekah thought about him in the 27th chapter and the 46th verse. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, like these Hittite women, my life will not be worth living." Can you just imagine what Thanksgiving was like at that house? Some of you don't have any trouble because that's the way Thanksgiving is at your house. Let's all get together. Nope, that's a bad idea. I'm telling you, it's a bad idea. You get together an hour later after everyone's good and drunk and stupid. They all go home and you say, "Yep, that was another bad idea." Come on, y'all. I'm walking around in some of y'all's living room, aren't I? Just a terrible, terrible family. So we have this family which is supposedly God worshipers. They're supposed to be in love with a holy God, but their home is full of lying and abuse and manipulation and violence and blatant hypocrisy. Is it any wonder that Jacob never believed in their God, never connected? Is it any mystery that their God never became their son's God? And I would imagine for some of you, Jacob's story sounds very familiar. You grew up in what was supposedly a Christian home. You were raised in a very small, religiously oriented community. We're supposed to be at the buckle of the Bible Belt here in this part of the state. You watched people close to you go to the church and sing the songs and say the prayers. But what you saw in your home between your parents when no one else was around was just blatant hypocrisy. Your dad was a deacon at the church, but he was a drunk at home. Your mom taught Sunday school, but you watched her gossip and cheat Monday through Friday. Maybe they ignored you. Worse, maybe some of them who went to church with you abused you in secret when they were home. Maybe every family gathering that you ever had was full of tension and anger, competition and violence, but you all looked like a Hallmark gift card when you showed up at church on Sunday morning. It is awfully hard to see God anywhere when you never see Him at home. And I'm going to say that again. It is awfully hard to see God anywhere when you never see Him at home. And I'm certain that this is a huge part of Jacob's struggle. It would be for you. But here's the truth that you're all going to have to deal with at some point in your life. Eventually, every one of us is going to have to do our own business with God. Eventually, every one of us is going to have to do our own business with God. You can only go so long in life using your parents' hypocrisy or your preacher's hypocrisy or the hypocrisy at your church as a convenient excuse for your own sin and selfishness. When it is time to do business with God, He is only going to deal with your business. God is not going to ask you about your drunk father or your crazy brother or your codependent and manipulative mother. You've got to stand before your Maker, and you've got to stand there by yourself. In the end, it's about you and God. And I'm going to tell you something else. Every one of us has taken part in this sin and dysfunction that mars our world. Every one of us has our own things that we need to deal with when it comes to God. So what chance does anyone have when they're raised in such a selfish, dysfunctional, violent, and sinful environment? How can any of us ever understand that when we've been raised in a world so steeped in religion but so alienated from God, how is God going to get our attention? Well, that brings me to this. Here's a lesson that we all have to learn. In verse 12 it says, Jacob had a dream, and he saw a stairway resting on the earth. Its top was reaching up to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac, and I'll give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you'll spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all of the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And I'll be with you. I'll watch over you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I've done what I promised. Do you guys realize how exhausted you have to be to fall asleep using a rock as a pillow? Jacob was worn out. This wasn't some dream vacation that he had on his daytimer and had been saving up for with great excitement. This wasn't what he was going through. Jacob left home because his brother is going to kill him. And his mom and dad are smart enough to think, maybe we better get him out of here before his brother does it. And so he stopped, he set out from home, and he stopped for the night, the Bible says, because the sun had gone down. So Jacob went as far as he could, as fast as he could, as long as he could before he stopped, and he was worn out, and he had a dream. God had to speak to Jacob while he was asleep because Jacob never stopped running hard and talking fast when he was awake. When he was awake, Jacob was always planning his next hustle and how he would talk somebody out of the next thing that he wanted. He was always working the next angle. Jacob was always trying to figure out how to get what he wanted and what he believed he needed from his brother, from his father. However he had to get it, Jacob was always working the plan. Either he was running to catch something that he needed or running to get away from something that he had done. Does any of that sound familiar? Working, killing yourself, either trying to get something you think you desperately need or running hard to stay away from something you've already done. That's the way Jacob was living his life. It describes all of us in some way. And folks, I want you to understand, I think it's nice that Jacob had a good relationship with his mom, but the relationship that he had with his father had to be a heartache for him. It would be for any son. Esau went with dad on the hunting trips. Esau made the football team. It was Esau's trophies that lined the shelf on his dad's office. And everyone knew that Esau was the one that his father was going to bless when the time came for it to happen. So, yeah, maybe it was nice that Mom Rebecca made over Jacob the way that she did, but no matter how special Rebecca tried to make Jacob feel about himself, everybody knew Jacob was no Esau. Esau was the athlete. Esau was the good-looking one. And we all struggle to some degree like that. We all have in our minds, or in reality maybe, some person, some image, some standard of what we think we should be, something that we measure ourselves against. We're never going to be as good as that. We're never going to be quite that good. All of us have some image in our mind that we're trying to live up to. And it's worse for us now than it's ever been here in this century, because now Esau's can torment us on Facebook and Instagram. Now your Esau's, you take them home with you and you open up their stories while you're at home, supposedly alone and relaxing, and you pop open Facebook and there's Esau. You guys know what I'm talking about. They get more likes than you do. Every post they put up gets more likes than yours. You open it up every second of every day, and there's their dream vacation. And there's their awesome date night with their husband who loves them so much. And there they are with their perfect little honor roll student, getting student of the month this month. And there they are. Wait, great. They're going to share with me today what the Lord showed them in their 3-hour Bible study. And you guys know, you read for 15 minutes and you're yelling at your kids, stop it or I'll kill you. And I've been on this kale diet and I've lost 28 pounds this month. Like, love. And it's eating your guts out, isn't it? You're going like, but inside you're going, I hate you. By the way, it's all a lie. It's all a lie. Let me say that again. Facebook land is a land of lies. Social media is a land of lies. Your Esau's are hunting you on your computer. We know they're better than us, though. We know the Father loves them more. They got to go on that vacation. Their kids are happy. Their husbands love them. They're losing weight. They're fitting into 32-inch jeans. We hate them, and we hate God for making it like that. And we also start to hate ourselves because we think that image is the person we have to become if we're ever going to be able to love ourselves and if the Father's ever going to love us and bless us. And we know we can't pull it off. So we either try to fake it, or we try and take it. We do everything we can to steal the blessing, earn the love, merit the acceptance, feel worthy, and it's useless and it's exhausting. It wears us down. So Jacob passes out. He's worn out, and he has this dream of a stairway coming down and touching earth. Now, the King James Version says it was a ladder, but stairway, I think, is the better translation. Commentators say it was the sort of stairs. You guys remember the story of the Tower of Babel, where they built this big tower with a stairway because they had this ridiculous idea that if they just built high enough and worked hard enough and sacrificed well enough, that they could get to God. These people had this crazy idea that they could reach God. And I will tell you that in every religion and in most of our hearts, with all of our work and all of our hustle, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a stairway. We're trying to be good enough and accomplished enough to earn the Father's blessing. So when Jacob sees a stairway, he understands that picture. But here's what's radically different he'd never seen before. Jacob didn't build this stairway. God did. And Jacob couldn't climb this stairway. All Jacob is doing is laying there because he's worn out and he doesn't have the strength to do it anymore. And God blesses him. God says to him, I'm your father's God. I'll give this to you. I'll make this for you. And I will be with you. And I will use you. And all Jacob is doing is laying there completely worn out. He can't do any of this. He just has to believe and receive it. The stairway isn't there for you to climb up. The stairway is there so that God can come down. This is a picture of God's grace. What God is trying to say to your exhausted soul, you know what I'm talking about. Just like Jacob, when you get to the end of your day and your head hits your pillow and you are so worn out, I was going to try and do better today, and I cussed that person out. I was going to try and be more attentive to my kids. I was going to try and read my Bible. I was going to try, and I screwed it up so bad. And another night, another sleepless night, and you're completely wore out. This is a picture of a God who loves you anyway. This is a picture of God's grace. This is God speaking to your exhausted soul and saying, you cannot get to me, but I'm going to come to you. You can't earn my blessings, but I'm going to give it to you. This is the God at the top of the stairs. This is the God who enters your story with his goodness and grace. This is what Jesus was talking about. You remember when Nathanael found him sitting at the base of the tree, and he says, I think that you might be our Messiah. And Jesus says, very truly, I tell you, Nathanael, you're going to see heaven opened up, and you're going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. What Jesus is reminding them of is Jacob's dream, and what he's telling us is this: the stairway that God used to touch the world and bless our lives is Jesus. Grace of God coming down to us. He said it this way: I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to the Father unless they come by me. Jesus is the stairway. Jesus is the source of forgiveness and acceptance and blessing. Every healing, every salvation, every victory, every hope, everything that is good and perfect in life comes down from above. We can't get there. he comes running to us. We can't climb the stairs, but he runs to us. This is a lesson, folks, that you've all got to learn. All of you who are wearing yourselves out trying to be good enough and trying to impress people, at some point in your life when you're worn out by the effort and you're wrung out on the floor, you finally have got to learn it has to be given to you. You can't earn this. You're never going to make it high enough on the stairway to reach God. God's got to run down the stairway to you. This is the only hope we have. The only forgiveness and the only healing for our hearts comes as a gift. Quit trying to earn it. Quit trying to run up the stairs. Quit trying to catch up with someone or get away from something. Quit trying to catch up to some image. Quit trying to run away from your past. Just stop and let God give it to you. That's what God's trying to say. And if you ever meet this God, here's what it's going to produce in your life. A life-changing response. So Jacob wakes up, and the scripture says, when Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I wasn't aware of it. And he was afraid. And he said, how awesome is this place? This is not only the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And so early the next morning, Jacob took that stone he had placed under his head, all of that stuff he couldn't figure out, his whole messy life where he was just messing it all up. That was his failure, his incompetence. And he sets it up as a pillar to God. He poured oil on top of it, and he calls this place Bethel, which means the house of God. And then Jacob makes a vow and says, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking and give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I've set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I'll give you back a tenth. So Jacob has this encounter with God. And the first reaction the scripture says is he was afraid. Now that kind of surprised me at first, but then I remembered I'm a church brat. And so we are kind of caught off guard by this reaction because so many of us have never bumped into the real God. If you ever do, it'll shake you up a little bit. It reminded me when I was living in Loudonville, Ohio. I was in, I think, 4th or 5th grade, and we lived in a 2-story old house, a house that was built in the 19th century, and it was down by the river. And I had a best friend over, and it was late at night. My parents had gone to bed upstairs, and they'd let us stay up. And we were downstairs running around, and we finally settled in about 1 o'clock in the morning. We were telling ghost stories. Man, we were good at it. My friend Mike McCaskey told the best ghost stories. But what Dad had failed to tell us was that he had bought an alarm clock radio. Now, in 1976, that was cutting-edge technology, folks. Now you will only find them in time capsules, so let me explain. An alarm clock radio was where you could set it to a certain hour, and when that hour struck, the radio would turn on. My dad had bought this and had not bothered to change the setting from 2 a.m. So at 1:30, we start telling ghost stories, and at 2 a.m., the Rolling Stones come on full blast in my living room. Man, let me tell you, my little body went into shock. My whole body locked up, and then we sprinted in every direction. And then we start creeping back in the room, and look, who turned the radio on? We knew there was some long-haired rock star ghost that had invaded our house. I believed in ghosts then, and it scared me to death. When something you've been told all of your life exists really shows up, it has that effect on you. Here's what C.S. Lewis says: there comes a moment when children who have been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who dabbled at religion or played going to church suddenly draw back. Supposing you really found him. We never meant it to come to that. We never meant it to really meet God. Supposing you really found him. Or worse still, supposing he found us. Part of what frightened Jacob was simply that he had encountered God, and God is huge and powerful and inspiring. But I think it was more. And I think this is what keeps so many of us away from ever encountering the real God. Because in the back of our minds, we know if we ever meet the real God, real change is going to take place. Life's going to be different for me if I ever meet the real God. See how he reacts? Suddenly he believes that God is real and active in our world. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. He doesn't have it figured out yet. None of us do. But he does know God is real, and God touches this earth. And so, because of that, I've got to worship him. He sets up an altar. He says, I'm going to build a house for God in this place. If God is real, I've got to build altars to him. If God is real, then I have to use my life to honor him. If God is real, I'm obligated to notice him and interact with him. Don't tell me that you believe in God if you never intentionally try to spend time with him, if you don't ever pray to him, if you don't ever build altars to him, if you never set aside an hour to worship him with his people. If God doesn't make it onto your day timer, then you haven't met the real God yet. And then he gives to God. He says, everything that you bless me with, I'll give you back. 1/10 of everything that you bless me with. Now again, there's a lot that needs to be explained and a lot that we could discuss here, but we don't have the time this morning. But let me say this. This is the principle. If you have met and connected with the real God, it will impact and change how you use your life, how you spend your money, what you give to. Folks, listen, when you meet the real God, it changes everything. So if God doesn't make it onto your day planner and God never enters into your checkbook, you haven't met the real God yet. That's why we're afraid to meet the real God, because we know if we ever do, it changes everything. The grace of God isn't something he gives us to make us feel better about ourselves. The grace of God comes to our life to change us, inform us, and control the way we walk and live on a daily basis. Once Jacob sees this, he makes a change and he vows, God, because you're real, because you came after me and blessed me, anything you ask from me, I'm going to give it to you, period. That's how the Lord used him and how he uses us to bless other people. Now listen, we're going to bump into Jacob again. We're going to interact with him again during this series, and what you're going to learn is he didn't get it all figured out right here. Folks, Jacob's still a mess in a lot of ways. You're going to see this the next time we talk about him. You're going to see that even 20 years later, God's still untying knots in Jacob's life. But folks, that's just the way it is. None of us. Just because you make a trip to an altar, you don't get up and be perfect that moment. And what's really great about that is God will take us just that way and be patient with us just like that. Some of you have been walking with God for 20 years and you still know you got knots he needs to untangle. But the great thing is God said to Jacob, I will be with you and I will never leave you. And he keeps that promise. You folks, people walk into church every week that their lives are a mess. Whenever somebody says to me, I don't go to church anymore because the church is full of hypocrites, I always want to say, well, then you ought to feel right at home. Come on in. I'll introduce you to all the other hypocrites. Hey, we're all getting fixed as we go along, but the good news is it changed. It began to change the minute we met the living God. Jacob leaves this encounter and he's still got bad habits, still falls back into old behaviors from time to time, still has so much to learn. When you meet God, it'll be the same way for you. So don't think, I'm gonna give you the invitation to meet the living God. This morning, you could do that. But don't think that everything's going to be perfect. But I'm telling you, the only way it begins to change is if you meet the living God. The change starts there. The miracle is initiated the moment the God at the top of the stairs comes down into your life. Why not make that today? Some of you have been going to church for so long. You've never asked the real God into your heart. Why not today? Why do you keep running from him? And how long are you going to keep running from your past? How many nights are you going to go to bed exhausted without the help that you need? The living God is here. You can come to an altar and meet him this morning. I hope you'll take advantage of the chance. Why don't y'all bow your heads with me? For your patience, we praise you. It's an amazing thing, your grace, that you love us and you pursue us when you see how we lie to ourselves and to other people. When you see how we medicate ourselves and how strung out and useless we can become. Some of us are tired now, God, of playing the game. We're tired of trying to dress ourselves up and cover ourselves up. We just don't care anymore who's impressed or who's not. We know we need you. So I pray that you'll whisper your acceptance into our ears this morning, and we'll have the courage to believe you. And Lord, for those of us who've known you for a long time, and even after years of walking with you, this past week we said and did things that we know don't measure up. It'd be easy for us to accept that disconnect as normal. It would be easy for us to walk away, but what we really want is to be close to you again. And I said it earlier today, and I mean it, Lord. I'm almost embarrassed to ask, because I know I'm not worthy. I think we all feel that way. To invite you into this life of ours that is so messy and so humble and so common. To invite you into our arguments, into our passive-aggressive stupidity and the way we treat the folks we're married to and supposed to love. To invite you into the night that we found out something about our kids that we thought we'd never hear. We're embarrassed by it. And we don't want anyone to know. But we lift our eyes up to you this morning, and we ask you again, if you would just love us enough to come down the stairs. You're the only hope we have. And because we know you'll come, we bless you. We lift our hearts and our arms up to you. Father, love us again this morning, we pray. In Jesus' name and for his glory, we ask it.